Epithelial tissue is important because it lines your body openings, cavities, and surfaces. So wherever you've got a surface, whether we're talking about the surface of the outside of the body, or the inside of the oral cavity, or the inside of your digestive tract, wherever we have openings, or cavities, or surfaces, those are going to be lined with epithelial tissue. One of the important characteristics of epithelial tissue is that in epithelial tissue, the cells are very close together, and there's very little extracellular matrix in between them. So this is a tissue where the cells are performing the main function rather than the extracellular matrix. Epithelial tissues are always supported by an underlying layer of connective tissue. So wherever we find epithelial tissue, it has to be held in place by a layer of connective tissue. The surface of the epithelial tissue that is connected to the underlying connective tissue is called the basal surface, sort of the connected or attached surface. The other surface of the epithelial tissue, that surface that's facing the opening or the outside, is called the apical surface of the epithelial tissue. The connective tissue under our epithelial tissue is very important to provide not only connection, but also support for the epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue cells are packed so closely together that we don't have blood vessels running through the epithelium. That means that the epithelial cells have to be able to exchange materials with the blood vessels found in the underlying connective tissue. With this blood supply from the connective tissue, epithelial tissue cells in general are able to divide relatively quickly. This is important when it comes to healing. Damage to epithelial tissue is typically healed relatively quickly as the cells of the epithelial tissue divide to replace the damaged cells. We're going to look at several different types of epithelial tissue that are classified according to the shape of the cells involved and the number of layers of cells involved. If we take a look at cell shape, epithelial tissues come in three basic cell shapes. We have flat cells, we call those squamous cells. We saw squamous epithelial cells when we did our cheek scrapings during the cells lab. Those were flat cells. Some epithelial cells are cuboidal. That means that they're shaped like cubes. They're about as tall as they are wide. One of the characteristics that can help you identify cuboidal cells in epithelial tissue is that they tend to have very round nuclei. The nucleus of a cuboidal cell is nice and spherical inside the cube-shaped cell. The third cell shape we find in epithelial tissue is columnar. Columnar cells are taller than they are wide. They're like columns. The nuclei of columnar cells tend to be oval in shape instead of the round nuclei that we see in cuboidal cells. Different types of epithelial cells contain different numbers of layers. Some of our epithelial cells are what we call simple epithelium. Simple epithelium is made of a single layer of cells. The important thing about simple epithelial layers is that because they're relatively thin, being only one cell thick, they're good for things like exchange of materials, so we can exchange gases back and forth more easily across a simple layer of epithelium than we could across multiple layers. We also see simple epithelium in areas where we need secretion or absorption. So whether we're trying to release something or trying to absorb, it works best through just a single layer of cells. Other epithelial tissues are stratified. Stratified epithelium is epithelium with more than one layer. This could be just a couple layers or it could be many layers. In general, stratified epithelium is important for providing protection. We find stratified epithelium in areas of the body that are likely to experience some sort of stress, like the skin that's always being rubbed and bumped and scraped against things, or the inside of the mouth, which frequently has a lot of friction from the movement of food inside, or the rubbing of the teeth against your cheeks. These areas need the protection that's afforded by having multiple layers of epithelial cells. A slightly odd sort of epithelial tissue is what's called pseudostratified. In this type of epithelium, all of the cells are connected to the underlying connective tissue at the basal surface, but not all of them reach all the way to the apical surface. And we end up with a tissue that looks like it has different layers because we have nuclei at a lot of different levels, but in fact it really is only one layer of cells. Epithelial tissues have some other special features that we should talk about, especially when it comes to what's going on at the apical surface of the cells. Some epithelial tissues have what are called microvilli. Microvilli are folds in the surface of the epithelial cells. When we take something that could be flat and instead put in a lot of folds, that really increases the surface area. And that's the function of microvilli. They increase the surface area of those epithelial cells. That allows for better exchange of materials in and out of those cells. We can get better absorption and secretion if we've got a lot of microvilli increasing the surface area. A different sort of specialization that we can find on the surface of epithelium is cilia. Cilia we talked about just a little bit when we were talking about the cytoskeleton, because these are the short hair-like projections that contain microtubules. And the microtubules allow these cilia to wave so that they create movement or currents. We find epithelium with cilia lining the respiratory tract. It's really important here because the respiratory tract has a layer of mucus that helps to trap pathogens and dirt, and particles and pollution and nasty things that we breathe into our lungs. The cilia then wave and move dirty mucus up through the respiratory tract until we can bring it up to the mouth, where we swallow it and it goes into the stomach. That sounds pretty disgusting, that every time you swallow, you're swallowing bits of mucus being brought up from your respiratory tract. But that's the way the system evolved to move the dirty mucus out and put it into the stomach where the digestive enzymes and acid can destroy whatever was in there. Another specialization we find on the surface of some epithelial tissue is keratin. Some epithelial tissues are keratinized, meaning they have layers of keratin on them. Keratin is a tough protein, and having layers of keratin on the surface of a tissue provides an additional protective layer. The skin is keratinized epithelium. The keratin helps to protect the surface of the skin. One more feature that we find in some epithelial tissues is goblet cells. Goblet cells are cells that are specialized to produce mucus. This mucus is important in a couple of different ways. In the respiratory system, we already discussed the fact that the mucus helps to trap pathogens. We see goblet cells in our intestinal epithelium as well, and in those areas the mucus helps to provide a protective layer to keep the digestive enzymes from damaging the intestinal cells.